Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another restful episode of true scary stories to help you fall asleep. Today, we're going to be having our weekly compilation of true scary stories. I hope you enjoy them. So without further ado, lay back, relax, and enjoy these true scary stories. I was born and raised in the southern United States, but decided to move to Minnesota back in the early 2000s. I moved up there with the original intent of going to the University of Minnesota, as they supposedly had a good atmospheric science program, and I knew people that lived in the state, and no one in Oklahoma or I'd have gone there. I ended up not going to college, and just lived with friends. I started dating a Canadian girl, and my home was a 4-hour drive from the border up the Minnesota Arrowhead. It was just after Christmas that year, and I was heading back after spending time with my then girlfriend. It was around dusk when I left. Her house was an hour from the border. I crossed back with no problem. Started driving down Highway 61 like I've done dozens of times before. For those not familiar, this highway runs right along Lake Superior, and is only traveled that late by those that live there in the few double-digit populated towns, and truckers going from Duluth/Superior to Thunder Bay. The weather was clear, the roads were clear, so I sailed at 60 miles per hour like usual. Well, the road was clear until I hit a patch of black ice. I completely lost control and sailed off the highway. I didn't know if I'd go into the woods on one side or a partially frozen Lake Superior on the other. Luckily, I went towards the woods. I barrel rolled a few times and landed on my wheels. I was in a shallow ravine, so my car was hard to see unless you were looking for it. I think it was single-digit temperatures outside. This was before the ubiquity of cell phones. There was zero signal where I crashed, so I was alone, freezing, and on a desolate highway near a patch of black ice that could make someone else sail right into me. I'm not sure how long I was out there, but eventually a local found me and took me to the hospital. I somehow escaped with a few cuts and bruises from the crash, and other than that and being very cold, I was okay. The state police officer that was at the crash scene when we got back to my car said by all accounts I should have died. If not directly from the crash, then from being a meat popsicle. I had no way of contacting my friends or my girlfriend, and I was at least a 4-hour drive from home. The local that found me offered me a place to stay until someone could come get me. I was there for 3 days until a friend in Duluth was able to come get me. His name was John, and I'll never, ever forget him. He died in 2018 at 70 years old. I had long since moved back to the South, but kept in touch with him by email. After I crashed, I was in a place that I didn't really know, at night, on a road that's not traveled by much that late, in winter, and freezing. Every moment that passed without a car or semi passing by, I thought that I would freeze to death. I was absolutely terrified. But then John came along and saved my life, and for that, I'll be eternally grateful. I was driving from Chicago to see a friend during break, and had to go through a truly desolate part of North Carolina. I'm talking miles upon miles of soybeans and tobacco, with very few people. Some towns felt like you were stepping back into the 50s. My car was a piece of crap, and I was driving on this sun-baked highway road next to some cornfields, when all of a sudden my wheels lock up. I later found out the cause was my alternator failing, and I'm skidding at around 65 miles per hour towards a depression in the cornfields. The car rolls off the highway, lands sideways, and I'm stuck in my car, with my seatbelt on and the airbags deployed, nearly delirious. I had a pretty nasty concussion and was starting to hallucinate someone shouting my name and playing music. It was August, and the temperature had to be at least 94 plus degrees. Basically, I was pretty set on dying until an incredibly kind older man who owned the farmland I had so graciously crashed on found me while he checked on his crops. I don't remember much in the way of transport, but he had gotten my dad's cell phone from my phone and called to let him know who he was and what happened. Both parents were about 12 hours away, and this kind gentleman brought me into his home and helped me seek medical attention until my dad could come meet me. Some people are just incredibly good people, and I'll never forget him. I was with my wife and kids in New Smyrna Beach, Florida, and felt pretty comfortable in the water because I grew up near there, and this is my home beach as a kid. I went out at around 7 a.m. to take some pictures of the waves by myself. If you know this beach, a sandbar develops about 60 yards offshore that you have to swim out to. Only about shoulder-high water, and then you get to the sandbar, which you're about waist-high. I'm out there taking pictures by myself, and about 8 feet behind me is a big black object in the water. It was so big I thought that it was a manatee at first. I then realized it is a bull shark checking me out. Nobody out there. No surfboard. Just me and a tiny camera. I faced the shark as that is what you're supposed to do, and then it turned away. I then had to make the decision to swim back via sprint or slow and calm. I yelled to the beach. It was a panic yell for my wife to watch me, and she had no idea what was going on. I did the quietest and fastest freestyle swim of 60 yards. It was the scariest minutes of my life. I don't have a crazy fear of sharks, but I was really scared of a big bull shark in murky water. When I was about 8, I was deep in the woods at my uncle's house. The parents went out and the 5 kids, 4 to 14, stayed home. We were playing a hide-and-seek game in the house with no lights on. There weren't street lights or anything, so you couldn't see anything at all. Base was in the living room, and I hid in the living room, so I could quickly get to base. My brother, who was 11, was it. He was doing his countdown, and I was hiding just a couple of feet from him when a lightning strike drew our attention to the window. We were both shocked to see the outline of a man in the window trying to see in. We started whispering, and on the next lightning strike, the guy was starting to walk to the front door. My brother Ben quickly ran to lock the front door. I know, but it was a different time and place. And got there right before the guy started shaking the handle. Ben started flipping on the lights, presumably so the guy would know people were home and he'd leave. And he yelled for me to go lock the other doors. I ran and locked the kitchen door, and then to the sliding glass door at the back of the house. As I was locking that door, the guy was suddenly there, standing there on the other side of the glass. I was frozen, but Ben calmly told me to close the curtain, and I focused on his voice and did what he said. My uncle has guns, but he was gone on a hunting trip, so all we could find was a BB gun that looked like a real rifle. Ben stepped out on the porch with it to try to make the guy believe that we were armed. We constantly had phone issues. This is going way back, but they had a party line, and we couldn't get the phone to work to make a call. We were trying to call someone on my uncle's CB radio, but weren't getting anyone. Eventually, an older cousin, who was only like 15 himself, showed up, and we thought an adult was there and we had been saved. That calmed us down, and we went back to normal, I guess. I'm not sure I've ever had a creepier moment than looking up at a window and seeing someone on the other side. Growing up, the city I lived in had a huge Halloween cornfield attraction with several haunted houses. It was always crazy busy and crowded. When I was about 12 years old, a group of my friends made a plan to go out one night. My parents were pretty strict and always anxious about me going places. They said that I absolutely could not go unless the group was accompanied by parents. I lied that there would be parents, when in reality it was a group of about 6 of us 12-year-olds. When we arrived, I was nervous because I never really lied to my parents before. The night went on and everything was going well, up until I had to go to the bathroom. The cornfield only had porta potties, so I went while my friends waited for me outside. Only when I came out, my friends were nowhere to be found. I walked around for a bit and called them, but I could not find them anywhere. At this point, I started panicking and crying. A police officer approached me and asked what was wrong. I explained that I could not find my friends, so he took my hand and said that we could go to the ticket booth so they would make an announcement over a loudspeaker for my friends to come meet me. However, the officer said we had to go back to his squad car first so he could let the other officer know. As I start walking with him through the parking lot, I had an oddly specific memory. A few days prior, my dad told me about a little girl who was kidnapped by someone who was impersonating a police officer. My dad told me to always be suspicious of everyone, including people claiming to be police. He instructed me to always ask to see a police officer's badge and to ask them to call my parents. I stopped walking and nervously told the officer, "I'm sorry, this is silly, but my dad told me that I need to ask to see an officer's badge and to tell them to call my parents." As I said this, the man's face went pale white. He let go of my hand and took off sprinting. I eventually called my parents. They came to pick me up and found the real police officers nearby. I let them know what happened, and they explained that would not have been the protocol, as the attractions didn't even have loudspeakers to make announcements. We then filed a formal police report. I'm pretty sure that I could have been kidnapped that night. We were on vacation at Lake Tahoe. A long story short, down a winding road you're led to the lake, and in the distance, we see the same tree that we saw our dad with in pictures during our childhood. We start running towards it. Me, my older and younger brother, my sister, and my cousin were all there, but my cousin and sister stayed behind. My brother and me walked to the brink of it, and as you know, Lake Tahoe is one of the clearest lakes in the world. You can see the bottom, the twigs and roots and everything. My younger brother watched us up on this huge, long, thick, rotting log. I asked my brother if I can jump off of it, and he says maybe. He remembers the water in the bank didn't feel too cold, so he says sure. I look at the bottom of the lake and count 1, 2, 3. I hesitate but jump in. I'm under for a moment, and it feels refreshingly cold. I swim to stay afloat, but all of a sudden I start sinking. I gasp and panic and scream my brother's name. The sheer panic in his eyes, wondering if he should jump in and risk both of us drowning. I swim over and grab onto the branches of the tree and try staying afloat. Everything is numb, and I'm in utter shock. He helps me climb up and get off. I'm shaking and freezing. My legs and some parts of my stomach are scratched, bleeding and beginning to bruise badly. I reach the bottom and fallen debris on the bottom cut me on impact. Walking back, we were talking about it, and I burst out sobbing. I thought for a second maybe my reality from that moment on was my brain trying to distract me from the fact that I had died drowning. I got home, took a shower, and I can't stand the lake. ever since. I used to work as a bouncer, and on one slow night, a guy tried to come into the club after last call, which we don't allow. And after arguing with me for a few minutes, he just tried to push his way into the door. I grabbed him by his dreads and threw him back into the street, and this made him pretty angry. He started telling me that I was a dead man and that he was going to his trunk, something that I'd heard dozens of times, and it was always just talk. He turned right around and hit the button on his keychain, and his car was literally parked right behind him, 10 feet in front of me. I look around and there's not a single other car or person out there other than he and I, and 2 other customers who were standing there next to me smoking. It was very strange because it was the main street at bar closing time, usually swarming with people and police. He pulled a gun out of the trunk and stuck it right in my face, and this was the first time I'd ever had this happen to me. I had often thought about a situation like this and joked about it with coworkers, saying that I'd take a guy down or knock him out if it ever happened. No, just fear. Luckily, I had nothing in my bowels to vacate, because I certainly would have if that wasn't the case. While trying to keep my voice from cracking, I used one arm to push the other 2 customers inside the door, and I said, "You're on camera. Get out of here." I backed up, locked the door, and puked in the bathroom for the next 15 minutes while the cops were called. Definitely the scariest moment of my entire life. I'm a fairly heavy sleeper. I grew up in South Florida, so if you don't gain the ability to sleep through heavy thunderstorms and strong winds blowing against your window, aided by the sweet sound of car alarms going off from thunderous booms, you were going to have a bad time. I'm serious when I say that it wasn't a weird thing for your house to shake from how loud these things were. On top of that, neighborhood dogs love to say what's up to each other at 2 a.m. It takes a lot to wake me up. I head to bed one night. No storm, and the dogs are silent, so I fell asleep faster than usual. I was up in the middle of the night to a loud scream. Just one, single, loud scream. Actually, now that I think about it, a better description would be a wail. It was the one, if not the most, disturbing thing that I have ever heard. I couldn't understand it, but I just felt disturbed and unsettled, and I found it hard to go back to bed. I just laid there for hours. It was nowhere near as loud as thunder or the dogs, but it was just horrifying. From the sound of it, it came from one of the neighbors, and from someone inside their house. I seriously considered calling the police because I thought someone got stabbed. I found out that the sound I heard was a mother crying for her dead son. He had died in a car accident that night, and the police had to go and tell the mother what happened. The guy was one of my brother's best friends growing up. There's a lot more to the story that I won't say, but the whole thing just makes me feel depressed. I got caught in a rock slide and fell off a cliff while backpacking. Early spring, things were starting to melt. We were hiking on a ridge and looking for a way down the side, maybe a 60 to 70 degree loose scree slope, to a stream about 500 feet below. I was in the lead, heading down at an angle. Rocks kicked out from under my feet, and I fell backwards onto my butt. All of a sudden, the entire slope around me began to move en masse, like an island of broken up rocks with me sitting in the middle. I rode it down the hill, bouncing off of stuff, and trying to stop myself and dig in, but no luck, just picking up speed. At the bottom, the hill dropped off to a 40-foot cliff, and I was launched off with the slide. I landed in a pile of debris and loose stuff that previously came down, including a lot of loose snow, which mostly absorbed the energy. I was mostly okay. Muddy, lots of scratches and bruises, a separated shoulder and a broken tailbone, but I was able to walk out. My one memory is being in midair, time standing still, and looking to my left at a stove-sized boulder likewise suspended in the air about 6 feet away. Any good-sized rock would have killed me. Back when I was about 6 or 7, we were visiting my aunt for Christmas, who had just divorced her husband. He was a hot-headed Czechoslovakian guy who had started going a little off the deep end. He had called the house multiple times over the past few days, threatening my aunt, but nothing had ever come from it. My parents and I just immigrated to Canada, where this story was taking place, so we were spending the night at my aunt's before our house was ready. My aunt was sitting in the den and looked up and saw her ex coming towards the house with a hunting rifle. She screamed, and my dad flew into action, locking the door and running myself, my aunt, and my mom up the stairs and locking us in a room. We put a dresser in front of the door while my dad grabbed a buck knife and ran downstairs. The rest of the story I only know as it's been told to me, but basically my mom called the police from the upstairs phone. But my aunt's ex busted open the door near where my dad was hiding. My dad jumped him, and they basically got into a fist fight in the foyer until the cops had showed up. I know my aunt's ex dropped the gun when he got hit, but I'm not sure what happened to the knife. My dad will not confirm to this day if he stabbed him or not. The police showed up and arrested my aunt's ex, but the scariest part was for sure that my aunt's ex's father was found hiding in the backyard when the police did a sweep of the house. He was an old abusive drunk that hated my aunt, and he had been waiting in the backyard with a knife, hoping we would have run out there. He ended up getting deported, and my aunt's ex went to jail and had a restraining order for years to come. Although he still claims they only wanted to scare people, it was a horrifying experience hearing the commotion from downstairs while we were hidden away. All I know is based on my dad's bravery and the beating that he must have put on that guy, based on the screams that we heard. We are safe to this day. I work in a mental health unit. Only 2 staff on nights. Other staff went to lay down for a few minutes as she was doing a double. Had my back turned for about 15 seconds, and a very sick man newly diagnosed with schizophrenia came behind me and got me in a chokehold. One of the scariest positions to be in. Even in our self-defense training, our trainers pretty much said, if someone gets you from behind in a hold, do whatever you need to do to live. I'm a pretty small human, so I really couldn't move despite flailing like crazy. He had my arms between my legs, so I couldn't reach for my panic alarm. The whole time he was singing Tiny Dancer into my ear. I'm thankful to whatever higher power is up there that another patient had woken up for some Tylenol. I was seeing stars at this point. I could feel my eyes bursting out of my head. I just remember thinking this is how I was going to die, and thinking about who would need to take care of my dog, and then everything went black. I woke up on a medical unit. I guess I'd pointed to a sign last second behind our nursing desk that instructs how to call a code white, a violent patient. And the patient who woke up did it successfully and kicked the guy holding me in the face to get him off of me before security came. It was all pretty messed up. I still see the patient that saved me on the unit every once in a while. I always buy him some chocolate bars and a coffee when he's here. I was robbed at gunpoint in 2001. I was living outside of Detroit and worked at an Ace Hardware as a lead cashier. I don't know if they still do this because I don't live in Minnesota anymore, but they used to have these weekly flyers that always had a coupon for some ridiculous deal, like 10 cents for a box cutter or something else that was a loss leader. It was super common for people to come in just to get their coupon item and nothing else. So it was a super busy Saturday just after my lunch break, and I just got back on my till. We had lines out to BFE, and so I got into the speed zone, just trying to get people cashed out without being rude. A dude walked up and put his coupon for a pack of light bulbs for $1.50. Crazy what deals stick in the mind. On the conveyor belt along with 2 singles. I smiled, asked how he was, rung him up, and immediately got the register open as I saw his payment right there. The next thing I knew is he's opening his coat up and pulling a gun on me and hissing at me. "Give me all your money." I kid you not. The first thing that I thought was, why does he even have that toy gun? And why is he pointing it at me? I just stood there staring at him in confusion. This made him angry and he cocked the pistol. It was a slide action one. Again, what you remember. And shoved it closer to me and repeats, "I said, give me your money." Then it hit me that it was a real gun, and I think I just went into autopilot. I took all the money out of my till and just kind of shoved it towards him, and he gathered it up and booked it out the door. I just stood there, and my coworker across the way started calling my name until I finally looked at her with a completely calm face and said, "I think someone just robbed me." Then my legs gave out and I just fell down and couldn't stop shaking. It only hit me then how I could have just died. Later, after that statement and the cops and everything, my coworkers and I surmised that it was a friend of someone who worked there, because they knew to hit my till, since I was head cashier, that had the most money in it. I still sometimes see that guy with his gun in my nightmares. As far as I know, they never caught him. I don't think a hardware store robber is high on their list of priorities. But needless to say, it's messed me up for a really long time. A morning within a few days of Christmas Eve, my oldest son's flu-like symptoms turned terrifying. We were relaxing, watching TV as he was out of it, and I was lucky that my wife recognized the warning signs. His stomach was sinking in and extending with each breath. It kicked in that he was struggling to breathe. We called 911, and they said while we waited for responders to take him out into the cold air without a jacket, it might help his congestion somehow. My wife's on the phone, and I'm standing in the driveway holding my little boy, and he's gasping now. His face is taking a tinge of blue, and all I can do is hold him and tell him it's okay, and it's gonna be alright, and to stay calm. Take nice big breaths, buddy. I felt so powerless and small. All I could do was hold him and soothe him and wait and not lose my crap for him. The firefighters first arrived and rushed up our yard with oxygen. They cheered for him and told him what a brave boy he was and that everything was going to be all right. My wife went into the ambulance with him while they kept him on oxygen, and they drove off because we had our second son, a baby at the time. I called my dad to come watch him, and he was over in an instant and drove to the hospital. The whole time there, not knowing what my boy was going through or if he was okay. I got there. He was doing great. Some steroids did the trick, and after a fun time hanging out with the docs, we went home the same night with some precautionary medication. I collapsed in my wife's arms taking a shower after he fell asleep, trying not to let my big ugly sobs wake him up. I've never felt so powerless ever in my life, and it was the scariest thing that I've ever gone through, including other situations where I thought that I might die. I was visiting some family in Edmonton years and years ago, and they used to have this big fair full of rides and attractions. I wish I could remember the name. All the rides were your standard carnival rides. The Gravitron, Tilt-A-Whirl, Log Flume, etc. I had gone to many of these traveling fairs in my time and had a good time, so thought nothing of it. After going on a few rides and having fun, I decided to go on that ride that is the boat that goes back and forth before going all the way around. So at the beginning, everything seemed fine. However, at a certain point when going back, the safety bar that was supposed to hold me in place just fell forward. It had not locked in, and the ride was underway. The ride started heading the other way, and the safety bar fell back onto me again. I pulled it as hard towards myself, hoping to lock it into place. Yet when we started heading back, the bar just flopped completely over again. I was really scared at this point. I literally thought that I was going to fall out of this ride and die. All of those carnival horror stories were true that I was fearing. I just wrapped my arms around the bar and held myself with my hands. If the worst happened, I would dangle from the bar that I thought. Fortunately, after a rocky ride, it came to an end, and I was safe with maybe only leaving my seat a few inches. I immediately ran to one of the workers after I got off and told them. The ride was shut down for 30 minutes after, and I was done having fun for the night. The only other time I've been that scared since was the few times that I've had sleep paralysis. My perception of time is off. I think this was last summer. I was out camping with the wife and kids, and we decided to go swimming. The kids were playing on the beach, and the wife and I decided to swim out to the boundary line and back. About 80% of the way there, we both got tired as we had grossly underestimated the strength of the wind and current we were swimming directly into. We turned around to go back, and it hit the wall. Neither of us could touch bottom, and were already completely out of breath from swimming against the current. We both started to hyperventilate, and each screamed towards shore once each. The beach was nearly empty other than 2 adults and 2 kids on the far opposite side of the beach in chairs with clothes on, who probably couldn't even hear us or tell what was going on. As we both started to fall swiftly into sheer panic that neither of us could breathe, and my wife started to go under, I used every last ounce of strength that I could muster and cheered her up on to keep going. Suddenly, I could just touch the bottom with my big toes extended down. I grabbed her arm and dragged her forward in the water until she could also touch, and we managed to get back to the shore. I've been swimming hundreds of times, maybe thousands. I grew up on the lake. Never have I felt so close to drowning in my entire life. We packed up camp that day and went home after she and I both fell asleep in the blistering summer heat at camp under a tree. I was seriously messed up mentally the several days following. It was a mistake I had never made before and definitely will never make again. We really should have known better, but we were enjoying the water. And it's difficult to explain, but the bay that we were in was so big that comparatively the distance that safety line was from the shore made it very hard to judge, and we both just made a bad decision because of that. On a calmer day, we might have made it to that line, but it was quite windy that day, and the current was way stronger than either of us had realized, until it was too late. I grew up thinking that my house was haunted. Weird stuff would happen all of the time. I'd walk into rooms and the lights would turn on. I'd go to the kitchen in the middle of the night and cupboards would be open. I'd hear footsteps upstairs when I was home alone. I'd feel the ghost sit down on bed while I was trying to sleep. You know, the typical haunting stuff that would freak any kid out. Then I had a stalker that started getting weird when I was in my late teens. Turns out, it was much, much worse than I could have ever imagined. The stalker was actually a peeping Tom that had been watching me since I was possibly as young as 7 years old. As it turns out, there was no ghost, and the house wasn't haunted. The psycho was breaking in when I was home alone and messing with me as a little kid. As I got older, he got more bold. He'd come in at night when my parents were home, and even sit on my bed while I was trying to sleep. I'm pretty sure that he found where my mom stashed the extra key and just made a copy. We never caught the guy, and the cops said that it was just some high school boy making jokes. I have had lots of therapy because of this situation. I was robbed at gunpoint in 2005. I worked for an Advanced Auto Parts in coastal South Carolina. 2 of our stores had been robbed in a 3-week period on Saturday nights, and we were all nervous that it could be us next. Sure enough. A little background. I was the 3rd key manager, or this store, and had one other person with me whose father happened to be a local police officer. Anyway, our Sunday night was stressful. We had the GM watching the place from across the street. Around closing time, we wanted to celebrate and order pizza. We asked the GM if she would pick it up. My partner started brining in outside merchandise when we got hit. Short white guy with a ski mask. Actually, it was a beanie with eyes cut out and a ball cap on. Comes in pointing a gun at us. I'm fairly big in stature, but I was scared of this guy. He pointed the gun right at me and demanded that we go to the safe. I opened the safe with the gun to my head. Then he made us lay on the floor. He cleared it out and started screaming at me about the money. The daytime manager did an early deposit and stashed the PC in a locker. This guy is going nuts, and I just plainly tell him, it's because of you. You hit 2 other stores. They are making daily deposits to limit the cash. And that's a paraphrase. I was mostly stammering and please sir and yes sir to him. He made us empty the registers and lay back down. He cleared them and bailed out. When the cops showed up, they were complete jerks to us, saying how we should have fought the guy, especially me since I'm bigger. We caught everything on camera. Little note about me. I'm big, but I'm not made to fight. I hate it. I don't mind sports much, etc. But unless I have to, I don't go looking for fights, especially with guys with guns. Not to say I never learned to defend myself, but I've only been compelled to hit someone a handful of times. My partner's dad showed up and was basically like, I had a bad feeling I should have checked on them because of everything, but I just didn't. So got robbed, made fun of by cops, and essentially not prioritized in lieu of the situation. I do have some PTSD about this, and somewhat of a complex. I wonder if I was a coward. The video clearly shows a few opportunities that I could have hit this guy, but I was scared to death. I had a gun held on me. Once the guy was caught, there were no bullets found on him, so it's a possibility that the gun was unloaded. Typing this out made me realize that I think I still have something to work out about this night. Dang. I woke up just at dawn to a thunderous boom and roar like a jet engine way southwest of the house. So deep the doors and windows were rattling, but the sound was steady and not getting louder or softer. As the sound continued, I felt less anxious and went to the sink to pour water for our morning coffee. As I started the water, I saw outside the kitchen window the sky light up with a rolling fire wall of red-yellow flames that were moving in all directions across the entire sky, including towards us. Thinking the worst and scared near to death, I immediately went into the bedroom and woke my wife up. I held her and kissed her, telling her that this may be it. The sky glow quickly subsided, thankfully, after all the loose gas burnt off. A large underground natural gas pipeline, 13 inches I believe, had burst. That was the initial boom, causing a huge pressurized release, which was the roar, that the wind carried south of town, that finally found an ignition source. It continued to burn for a while until it can be turned off with a loud roar, but contained to a quarter mile of the break with flames 400 foot up. Shortly thereafter, I turned on my police scanner. The first reported dispatch was from a town 12 miles away to the east. And when they got outside of town, they called in saying in disbelief that what they see is not their jurisdiction. At the same time, a town 15 miles to the south was notified by a truck driver that he could see the flame column straight in front of him and he was pulling over, despite being 12 miles down the road. Our town, closest, was the third call, although we were already on the way. It was really hard to miss. I was 12 years old at the time. I was staying at my mother's house for the weekend and she was drinking. She tends to change from extremely kind to horrible in seconds when she drinks, so we ended up arguing. I ran out of the house at 2 a.m. to run to my friend's house. I knew where he lived and how to get there. It was pitch black. The streets were so dark, and for some reason, not all of the streetlights were on. It was very quiet, but then a car pulled up in front of me. I was crossing a T-shaped street, and the men in the car told me to get in. So I ran into the dark park/playground nearby. I was, and still am, very short and skinny, so I could hide anywhere. As I was running into the park, I heard one of the men yelling and a car door slamming shut. I was hiding in the bush in the park, and I had such bad asthma after running the way that I did. It was so difficult to hold my breath and be as quiet as possible. They eventually gave up and drove away, but even at 23 years old, I'm still traumatized and can't bear to even see a park or a playground in the middle of night because it reminds me of what happened. I still have nightmares and won't go out alone, even during the day. This situation really has caused agoraphobia. I've shared a not as creepy event that's happened to me, but this particular occurrence never put me in any jeopardy. It was more my neighbors, but creepy nonetheless. Keep in mind that I am unsure of the exact age that I was during this series of events, but it took place over a majority of my life thus far, and promptly ended in 2011 when I was about 11. I remember most of these things happening, and my mom has filled me in on some of the details since. I'm not sure if it belongs here, but I really don't ever want to meet this person again. I live in a good neighborhood, in a good city. It was being built when we moved there. But I always remember these two being my neighbors. Their names were Betty and Jeff. The first interaction that I remember having with either of them was when Betty gave my sister and I a whole bunch of McDonald's toys. You know how they display every one of the toys inside? We got one of those displays. I was 5 and my sister was 2, and I remember being ecstatic as any younger child would be. My mom later informed me that Betty would tell her that we were the cutest kids in the world, and that she wished she had children like us. Flash forward a few years later, where I'm guessing that I was about 7 or 8. I was hanging out with another girl my age, and was also my neighbor down the street. We left my house, and we were walking to hers. When we got outside, we saw Betty throwing a bunch of Jeff's stuff out of the second-story window, I vividly remember her screaming profanities as she tossed an old TV set out the window, and smelling cologne that she must have thrown out the window as well. My friend and I rushed to get inside, and we just thought that she was crazy. Between the ages of 8 and 10, Betty and Jeff must have had a few more fights. There's nothing that I can remember, but I do remember my mother telling me that Betty confronted my dad. My dad had been outside doing yard work at about 8:30 or 9 p.m. It was summertime, so the sun was still out and the kids were still outside yelling and playing. All of a sudden, Betty marched out of her house and straight to my dad. She yelled at him for keeping everyone awake with the sound of a leaf blower, and probably called him an MFer a few times. I would understand her anger more if it was dark out, but it still kind of confuses me. Maybe she had a right to be angry. One day when I was 10, I had returned home from school to the sight of police cars and a bunch of yellow caution tape surrounding Betty and Jeff's house. I ran inside and asked my mom what had happened, but she had no clue. She later found out from my other neighbor that Betty had died, possibly by being thrown down the stairs or something like that. They were trying to figure out if it was self-inflicted, or if Jeff had finally lost his stuff and killed her. A few days later, I was outside by myself drawing with chalk. As soon as I got outside, I saw Jeff walk over to his glass door. He hadn't been arrested for anything yet, and was still presumed innocent. I thought I had nothing to worry about, so I continued on and retrieved my chalk from the garage. I began to draw when I noticed that Jeff was staring out his door, and staring directly at me. This continued for 10 minutes. I eventually got creeped out and went to tell my dad. By the time he came outside with me, Jeff had left the door. That's when I realized that maybe Jeff was the crazy one. In April of 2011, Jeff was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 30 years. He gave Betty a fatal dose of antifreeze, and I'm still unsure of whether he actually pushed her drugged and dead body down the stairs for good measure. After reading an article on it, Betty claimed that Jeff was very abusive and would not let her do anything without his permission. That would explain her behavior, but I'm still not completely convinced that she was entirely innocent either. A new couple has since moved into their house. They're completely normal from what I can tell. Knock on wood. And we haven't had any murderous events happen on my street since. This happened a little bit ago, about a month, and it was a bizarre experience to say the least. I'm 15, and I was playing some video games before passing out. It was about, say, 11 p.m. when I hear the doorbell ring. Out of instinct, I begin walking downstairs, but about halfway there, rationality came to mind. Who the heck rings a doorbell at 11 p.m.? I silently strode back upstairs and stood in the hall, kinda expecting something bad to happen. Exactly 1 minute later, it rings twice. My parents begin to leave their room and give me a quizzical look, and all I had to respond with was a shrug. Then he starts banging on the door. My mother jumps at the first bang, and my father's eyes widened, but more in confusion than fear. He decided to go downstairs and peep through the view hole. It was our neighbor. My dad hesitantly opened the door, and I could hear my father's voice tremble slightly. Hey, what do you need? Next thing I hear is an entire full-blown scream argument from our neighbor, claiming that this household was his and we stole it from him. My father's uneasiness was quickly replaced with annoyance, and he simply shut the door without giving our neighbor the time of day. My dad stepped on the first step going up the stairwell when our neighbor first hit the door. I'm not talking banging with a fist. This man was full-on body slamming it. My father was stunned for a second, and my neighbor charged the door again. This time we began to hear the splintering of wood. Everyone reacted at once. My father went to brace the door with his body. My mother went to go get the other 2 kids, and I went for 911. The body slamming ensued for another 5 minutes, and while I was on the phone with 911, it stopped. I thought it was over and I was relieved, but I still stuck on the phone. I go peek out the front window of my house, and boy was it only getting started. Our neighbor took his Jeep Wrangler and simply directed it straight at our house. We had zero clue what he was doing until he hit the gas and we heard the squealing of tires. Then he immediately hit the brakes. He was trying to scare us out of the house. I was still on the phone with 911, and I stepped away from the window to comfort my siblings, crack jokes and such. Eventually, police arrived and arrested him. The next morning, I left for school, still shaken from the night before. I stepped onto our front steps and saw tire marks leading up to our front door. The lunatic actually nearly rammed our door down with his car. I really never want to see this guy ever again. But he lives directly to my right. Also, I don't know if he has a mental illness or not. I'm sorry. And no, I'm not going to physically harm him via blade or bullet, so stop suggesting that. I also don't care if he had threatened us. The situation was resolved with no one harmed. Stop saying that I or my father should have hurt anyone. There was no need, rationality over emotion. And no, not even I trust my guardians with a firearm. I would probably be the best candidate for it, but I doubt my father will buy a gun and rely on his 15-year-old son to use it. Best that I wait until I'm of age. Hey everyone. This is a real story that has absolutely traumatized me and my boyfriend. 2 years ago, I moved to the UK for university, as I always wanted to go there and get away from my parents, as the situation at home was beginning to become a bit too toxic for me. In my first year at uni, I moved into a student accommodation and met some really great people. It was a good year, without meeting my boyfriend, who I'm still with and just enjoying my time away from my family and discovering what independence really meant. Anyhow, as second year came by, I decided with some friends to move into a house rented by student accommodations. But at least we had our own house and weren't restricted as much with noise and parties as living in a small shared flat like in the first year. Note, I had a ground floor room, and my window gave into a very small backyard, in which I would go smoke every day as I'm a smoker, and in which there would be a very thin wooden door giving into the other side of the street, where you would put your bins and broken chairs, blah blah blah. The door could only be closed and locked from inside the backyard, but since it was an old door, we had to attach some strings to keep it closed for good. I had neighbors on each side of the house, so we were surrounded by families and some other student accommodations. The neighbors on the right of us were 5 boys, who looked way over the age of being in university. They were strange, so to say. I met one of them outside of our house one day because of a police intervention due to one of his flatmates attacking him, and the others with a kitchen knife, and burning their kitchen down. I heard some screams, and so I went outside with my flatmates, and saw one of them being covered in blood and cuts everywhere on his arm, and a wound on his head inflicted by a kitchen knife. Me and my flatmates didn't know what to do, so we offered him to help to clean himself, and to give him an old t-shirt to change out of his bloody clothes. We then saw the guy who hurt these flatmates being escorted out by the police, and into a van and driven off to be arrested. I don't know anything more about the story. The police didn't really tell us anything else. Anyway, the guy who we helped was quite weird. He said a lot of stuff and kept trying to grab me and flirt with me. And we noticed when helping him he smoked quite a lot of marijuana, but just didn't really care at the moment, as we just wanted to make sure that he was okay, as we didn't know him. Then, after some time had passed, I would go to uni and come back home and see him quite often in the street, and just never said a word to him again. But one day, he came up to me in the street while I went to the corner shop and started talking to me weirdly. And I didn't feel comfortable at all with that for some reason, so I just didn't respond to him. He then just said, "Oh, that's okay. I'll just wait in front of your house then, and we can talk further." Needless to say, I was creeped out and just thought that he was joking. So I bought my drink at the shop and headed back to my street. And as I turned into the street where my house was, I saw him with his flatmate sitting on my doorstep and waiting for me. So I panicked and went back next to the corner shop and called my only guy flatmate to ask him to open the door and tell the guys to go away. But obviously he wasn't home and no one else was either. So I literally just waited it out until they left an hour later, and then sprinted back home and locked the front door. Note, my front door had a glass panel on it where you would be able to kind of make out who was standing in front of it. After this already pretty scary encounter, I just tried to avoid the guy, and mostly succeeded for a while. But then one day, as I went smoking in the backyard, I noticed that the wooden door, which is always closed, was open, and the strings that we put there to keep it closed were cut off. For whatever reason, I didn't think anything of it, and just closed the door again and put a new string on it, thinking that it was one of my flatmates who took the bins out and just didn't tie it back. The weird neighbors would often scream and yell and fight in their house, and it would wake me and my flatmates up in the middle of the night. But we kind of got used to it after a while. But one evening, my boyfriend slept over like he usually did, and he, who usually never wakes up because of noise, woke up in the middle of the night because of a bang and some whispering. I was sound asleep, so he very silently woke me up, and we both just waited in the dark and listened for any other noises. Suddenly, we heard the wooden door just bang, just shot open, and some footsteps next to my window. I always had my window open because it would get really warm inside. So we both just froze. And then we heard the door leading to the backyard get shaken softly, as if they were trying to get inside. And then they stopped. Luckily, we had the curtains closed, so they couldn't see us. But we were ready to get dressed and get out of the room and lock them in if they came in from the window. Then we just heard the window move and get more open, and one of the guys saying something in a different language that we didn't understand. And then we started to hear them trying to get in. My boyfriend and I just shot up out of the bed, took my phone, put on clothes, and ran out of the room and out of the house. I then called my flatmates and told them to lock themselves in their rooms, and then I called the police, who luckily came in less than 5 minutes, as the headquarters were only a couple streets down from us. I don't remember anything after the police came. I think that me and my boyfriend were in shock. They ended up catching one guy. The other fled and was later found a few streets up smoking weed. The police told us that they went inside of the house and found a lot of meth and heroin, and that they were just carrying a massive kitchen knife with them. I was so confused, as I've never done anything to offend or do anything wrong to my neighbors. So the idea of them breaking in with God knows what intentions with a kitchen knife terrorized me and my boyfriend. The two guys ended up being arrested, and one of them was put in prison for 2 years for carrying a weapon with intention to harm. I never heard anything else from the police, and I moved back home a few months later, as I was so scared and it tormented me for months on end, not knowing what would have happened if my boyfriend didn't wake up. I'm now still coping with it, and I find it really tough to get over it. I'm always asking myself, what if, and what would have happened? I now very often wake up because of the slightest noise, and I get horrible nightmares because of it. But hey, at least I'm still with my boyfriend, and we often talk about it, and it helps a lot. I am omitting identifying details for privacy's sake. If your world absolutely cannot go on without them, then I guess feel free to DM me. You've got a 50-50 shot of me answering or me telling you to leave me alone. But let's take it back to 2007 to 2008. I was 16 when this began, 18 or 19 when it finally went to court. Picture a Norman Rockwell-esque suburban family. Parents, 3 kids, a yard and a dog, and blink and you'll miss it, USA. One random day, a neighbor man has a mild dispute with his neighbor. As a totally warranted response, neighbor man takes every hose that he has and floods their yard. Solid decisions lead to solid consequences, so naturally he was fined for water waste. My parent runs the water in small-town USA, and because neighbor man lived a block from us, he decided to drive over to the water district, shouting that he is an acquaintance of my parent. Second solid decision of many to come from neighbor man. Absolutely no one takes kindly to name dropper folks, so tuck that gem away under life facts. My parent comes in and tells him that even if his kids did this, they would still have the same repercussions, gracefully glossing over the fact that, other than maybe driving by one another, none of us actually have ever interacted with neighbor man. Neighbor man repeats the name of the man working at the front desk, as well as my parents' name, and claims it's now personal, and storms out. My family members and I began to see neighbor man at random places constantly. The DMV, the grocery store, our respective jobs, etc. Apparently, when you're cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs and your parents pay for your house, you have all kinds of time to stalk. It went from random sightings while out and about to phone calls. The cliche 90s type of call, breathe, hang-ups, and the I can see you variety. At this point, neighbor man was more of an annoyance than scary. But as I've stated, when you underestimate crazy, you lose every time. Neighbor man began parking across from our house, staying from 6 p.m. to 4 a.m., literally just sitting in his car, blasting music, staring at the house. Fool must have had the determination and bladder of a racehorse, because who sits there for 10-ish hours? His music was trash too. Maybe he was a masochist, seeing how long that he could suffer through crappy music and a full bladder. I doubt that anyone with a semi-rational concept of social interaction could fathom why. This went on from 3 to 4 times a week to a nightly occurrence. Imagine being a 16-year-old female that doesn't even feel comfortable to change in her room because of the prospect that he might see through the blinds somehow. Trying to sleep knowing he's out there. We were prisoners in our own home. He began to get bolder. Neighbor man drove his car speeding and up onto the sidewalk at my sibling and her partner while they were on the sidewalk, out front coming home from a date. They both had to physically jump out of the way to avoid being hit. He made lewd gestures at me when I brought my dog out for a walk and was waiting for my sibling to come out and join us on the walk. It was so bad that I ended up crying and going back inside. This had been going on for a year at this point. The cops always said the same thing. There's nothing we can do unless there is a threat made against you or someone is harmed. My parent confronted, meaning tired of his crap and asking him what he thinks he's doing, neighbor man in the street after my incident, to which neighbor man called the cops, and they came asking us why we were harassing and threatening neighbor man. I will never understand why the system waits until you're a victim rather than prevents someone from being victimized. Almost 2 years in and it's Christmas time. My parent has a brain aneurysm. Fortunately, they made it through without any lingering effects, which is extremely rare. I convinced my other parent, who had been living at the hospital with their sick partner, to come home and shower and eat. At about 9 p.m., we get a knock at the door. A random man in random clothes, holding a Christmas present, says that he's here to deliver it to family name. We ask who sent him, and he says he can't say. We ask who he works for, and he shoves the gift at my parent and leaves. We were obviously very uncomfortable opening it. Parent decides that they need to know what it is and opens the present. Inside is a 17-page document of the grounds on why Neighborman is suing my parent that was currently in the hospital. Even I could tell that it was fake with the grammatical errors and typos. Neighborman took the time to set and type this up himself, thinking that it would scare us. The document and fake details that he put in did not. The fact that this 40-something-year-old man was so fixated on our family that he sat and typed a 17-page fake document did scare us, however. Things progress, and Neighborman began pacing in front of his car and pretending to have phone calls, and where he talked about pushing my parent down the stairs, or knowing where the kids went to school and work, and how easy it would be to access us at any time. At the time, I worked a closing shift, and it let me off at about 1 a.m. He would be parked next to my car and follow me home. One time, I even tried to take random roads, and he still stayed right behind me, pulling up to the house with Neighborman parked across the street. Think neighborhood street with maybe 5 feet between a car parked on one side and one on the other, and having to get out and run to the door was a nightmare. We were all exhausted from not only the aneurysm scare, but also living looking over our shoulders. My parents' friend told her friend, who is a DA, about the situation. She called and came over and took our case on pro bono. Testifying was a wild ride. We had to put in official statements prior to being called to the stand. We were not allowed to be in the room when a family member was testifying, nor were we allowed to talk in the halls as we waited for our turn. Imagine reliving 2+ years of traumatic experiences, being cross-examined where you're made out to be a liar, and then not able to have your family comfort or support you afterwards. Needless to say, it was not ideal. There was enough to put him away for 1.5 years, as well as a grant of felony restraining order. We moved while he was still incarcerated. My sister passed while he was in prison, and he immediately tried to sue her estate. She was 21 at the time of her death. He tried to sue her after he was released. He claimed that her testimony from him running his car at her and her pretending was false, and the only reason he was locked up. That's not the case, as there were harassment and stalking charges, and that the money that people donated to a GoFundMe for her accident, he was entitled to. There's so many more details, but this was already long enough. So Neighborman, let's never meet again. You made us prisoners in our home for years, and clearly, you are still the same, and have not learned a thing from your time locked up. The dumbest part about all of this is it's not even the first creepy experience that I've had living in this apartment. Both floor units are giant suck. I live on the bottom floor, in the back corner of an apartment building in a major city. One of my bedroom windows looks out into a ground-level, inaccessible dirt alleyway between my building and the one next door. Well, a weird new guy moved into the next door building, and boy does he chain smoke his heart out. Oftentimes he smokes cigarettes and sits in his window, but sometimes we will climb out and stand in the alley. The first time I ever noticed him, it was well after nightfall when I was home alone. I saw an ember levitating in the darkness, and then it dawned on me. It's someone smoking. In the pitch dark. I promptly closed the shutters, but not before noticing that he was looking directly into my bedroom. Okay, I get it. I'm moving around and I caught his eye. No big deal. Over the next few months, my boyfriend or I would notice him occasionally. If you lay on my bed, you are at a low enough angle where you can see him when he's at the window through the cracks in the blinds. We noticed that he always seems to be looking in my window's general direction. Always. He doesn't just smoke a cigarette here and there. This dude will either sit in his window and chain smoke for an hour or pop out several times at night. So it beckons the question, is he just looking in our general direction, or does he see us? I've been having some creepy things happening with a new neighbor in my apartment complex recently. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just overreacting, but I would love a second opinion. I'm a 24-year-old female college student living 2 blocks from school. I've lived in the same spot for 2 years, and I've never had any issues. I have a small emotional support dog that lives with me too. This will be important later. Things just got weird this last month. A guy moved into the apartment below me. His apartment is to the right of the only stairwell leading up to my house. I always have to walk by his door to walk to class, check my mail, or get into my car. To describe him, he honestly reminds me a lot of Norman Bates. Quiet, strange, small build, pale skin, and bright blue eyes. Something about him just seems off. I first met him when I was trying to leave my apartment. I was about to back up when some jerk pulled his car, blocking me from exiting. I was getting out of my car to ask him to pull forward, when my new neighbor was also getting into his car. Instead of letting me speak to this guy, he told him to move, and I politely said thank you and left. The next day, he was waiting outside by his bike to go to class. He instead follows me up the hill to make small talk. He asks me a lot of questions, which made me feel a little interrogated. Some of the questions were like, where are you from? How old are you? Are you single? How long have you been here? 2 days later, on a Saturday, he knocks on my door forcefully at 8 a.m. I jump up out of my sleep and look through the peephole to see him standing there, rocking back and forth. Mind you, I've only seen him twice, and we've never had a real conversation other than him trying to pry into my life like he knows me. He knocks on my door 3 more times, and finally just slips something underneath it and leaves. I wait about 10 minutes and open the door to find a note. It said, "Hello there, neighbor. I just have a few questions about your dog. How do you get away with having her? I want to get one but don't know how. I'd love to hear more. Cheers and kindest regards, Jimmy. P.S. Here's my number. Please text me." I decided to not text him because I don't like telling every person about why I have my dog. It's no one's business but mine and my realtor's. I also was uncomfortable with the fact that he came to my door with no knowledge that I lived in that specific unit. That's when things started to happen. He waits till I leave for school and rides his bike behind me. 2 weeks ago, I had to make several trips to my car because I brought groceries, and he stood by his window and watched me the entire time. Every time I go outside now, he watches me with the blinds open. He knows that I've noticed him too, but he doesn't seem to care. He just stares with a blank, lustful, or sinister look in his eyes. Yesterday, I took my dog outside, and he came outside of his house and stood at the back of the building to watch us play in the grass. He just stared at me. When I wanted to come back inside, he just watched me walk upstairs and pass him while he just had a cold look on his face. I've never been a woman who scares easily. I can take care of my own. But he is making me feel very, very uneasy. I live in a very small town, about a population of 1,100 if not less. Word gets around fast about a lot of things. I got the heads up in October of 2013 that I would be having a new neighbor soon, and he just got out of prison for some sort of crime. as he'd been registering on the offenders list. As a single female who lives alone and has some serious traumas, this did not set well with me, but the guy was pretty well shrouded in mystery, save for hearsay. When the guy first moved in, I was probably his biggest advocate. I kept telling people to give him a chance, because we still didn't really know what he was in prison for. I mean, hey, guys get put on the offender list even for peeing outside sometimes, right? But they don't go to prison for it either. Nevertheless, I decided I would try to keep an open mind. I'm going to take a minute to explain the layout of my apartment. My main entrance is a hidden door. I have a small driveway next to it and a bunch of bushes. The neighbor's house is right next to my entrance, separated by the bushes, and his front door pretty much faces mine, though mine faces to the south, while his is a straight view of my front door. I went weeks creeping around my own apartment in an effort not to have my new neighbor, even though I kept telling people to give him a chance. Admittedly, I was pretty weirded out by the situation, until one day, while I was trying to get back into my car to go to work, and suddenly the neighbor popped out from behind that row of bushes. It startled me, to be sure, but he introduced himself, and I introduced myself. He offered to trim the bushes. I'm not even kidding. Admittedly, I didn't know whether to laugh or be weirded out, but I just told him that I only rent the apartment, and I wasn't sure what my landlords would want. Sometime between here and there, it came out that he was in prison for attempted assault, as well as a slew of assault and battery charges. The official story goes that he was at a bar with several of his friends, and there was a group of women drinking there too. One of the girls felt sick and wanted to lay down in a friend's car in the parking lot, and he followed her, and yeah, you can see where it's going from there. I did not necessarily feel very endearing to him upon hearing that. I also felt the need to mention that we live within the school district. Elementary, middle, and high school are literally just up the street, and lots of parents were in an uproar about him living there, though I believe our state law indicates that there's no problem with it as long as no crimes were committed against a child. His parents were here with him for a bit, but I got the very distinct and accurate feeling that they were going to get him established here and then dump him on the community at large. In early November, I had a car accident. The neighbor came into my workplace, literally a block away. It's a small town, like I said. He came that afternoon. It was my day off, and started to ask my boss about me, starting with if I worked there. He almost had to have known since I walked to work pretty frequently, and at that point I wasn't trying to hide it. I was there first. No reason to go out of my way yet to avoid him. She said that his eyes were all over the place, like he was casing the joint, and he was rather possessive in speech. My neighbor. I met her, mine, me, mine, my, and asked if I'd been in a wreck. She confirmed, and he said that he'd have to bring me over a care package. That was the last thing that I wanted. The whole exchange left her with a rather sour feeling in her stomach, and she called me immediately to let me know what had just transpired. I'm still relieved to say that the care package never came, but it definitely put me on edge. Even more so when he came into my work that following Monday to get breakfast and told me that he didn't know that I worked there. All right, at that point in time, I was definitely sketched out. His parents left the day before Thanksgiving. Yep, they left their son all alone the day before Thanksgiving. While I don't really like the guy, I think that was pretty screwed up. Somewhere between this time period, I started noticing him watching me. Not too frequently when his parents were there, but just enough for me to notice that he was watching, and for my hackles to be raised. After his parents dumped him there, the watching became pretty constant, all the time. I would leave in the morning. He's at the front door watching. I would leave in the middle of the day, conveniently outside waving. Come home at night in the pitch darkness, still waiting and watching. Over the next month and a half, things really escalated on that front. I was feeling less and less safe about going home. Several friends and family members witnessed him watching me. He seemed to skulk around at weird times. On Thanksgiving Day, he hit all the houses of single women on the block and dropped off 3-pound bags of M&Ms for anyone. He tried to knock on my door, but I didn't answer, and I've pretty much stopped responding to door knocking that does not come with a phone call or text first. He went upstairs to my landlord's entrance, introduced himself, and asked that she make sure that I get some of the candy. Yeah, no thanks. I talked to a female police officer, the only one we have. Yeah, we are that much of a token community. And she told me to start logging everything, and that the police would do nightly checks on their ride-arounds. My landlord cleared out a space on the other side of the garage for me, so I no longer have to park around back. I can use the other set of stairs to get directly into my apartment. Someone brought me some pepper spray, which I never hope to use, and I also have a samurai sword at my disposal. Pretty far-fetched there, but hey, whatever makes you feel better, right? It makes me so mad at myself to admit that I'm still really scared of this guy, especially upon recently learning that he has military training. More recently, he was spotted just sitting outside of my work at around 8 p.m., well after closing time. When he was noticed, he just tried to casually disappear into the night air. The guy seems to go out of his way to creep people out, and yet seems to have no idea why no one wants him around. I'm happy to report that I see less of him these days since I park inside, but he does make random stops inside my work to get an odd assortment of items. I've been instructed to go hide in the back until he leaves, which sometimes takes forever, since he seems to stall now and wait for me to come out until he's exhausted of all of his conversation options. Has anyone dealt with anything similar to this? I'd love to hear what you guys have to say or think about this situation. This is less of a creepy one-person encounter, and more a whole community creeped out by one man. The neighbor in question is somewhat famous for his lawn, an impossibly thick green landscape that he had tended by a company. I've vaguely been aware of him losing it on the landscapers, screaming at them outside. Enough that I knew he had a temper. The first real red flag that he might be legit crazy came last summer. He asked a teenage boy in the neighborhood to check in on the house once a day and make sure all the doors and windows were secured and water their flowers. The day they left, though, he left a crazy list, saying the kid had to be there multiple times a day, turning off and on different sets of lights at specific times, and leaving weird chores for him. Also, the kid was not allowed to walk on the lawn, and had to remove his dirty shoes before walking on the concrete sidewalk. He was never to enter the house, but was to turn off and on the lights from the doorway by means of a stick with a loop on it. Also, he was not allowed to use the garden hose to water the lawn, and had to instead use a teeny tiny watering can. The letter implied that my neighbor would have the kid under surveillance and would have pictures if he failed to comply. Basically, the kid's parents called him and said that they weren't comfortable with the situation anymore, and while they would keep an eye on the house, the deal was off. They argued over the phone. When my neighbor got back from vacation, it was early morning, and he immediately went to their house, woke them, and tried to pick a fight with them. One of the other neighbors is a retired C, and came out to see what was going on, and tried to settle the issue. Crazy neighbor said that he would let it rest if he was allowed to bare butt spank the kid. He flipped out when they told him heck no. Sometime after this, another neighbor was at the grocery store when he was cornered by Crazy Neighbor. Crazy Neighbor apparently just talked at him in rapid fire for a half an hour. Among other things, he started saying how wives shouldn't have friends. After this, Everyone started talking about how you don't see his wife anywhere. Occasionally, she will be out watering flowers, but while her husband is seen out, she isn't. Considering that you used to be a social butterfly, this is weird. During the winter, everyone found pamphlets in their mailbox from the landscaper he uses, along with a note saying that it was mandatory to now use this landscaper in our area, and failure to comply will result in being sued. We are private, single-family homes with no HOA, so this is patently untrue. During the winter, someone saw his wife, and her arm was in a sling and she had a black eye. When they went to ask her about it, he wouldn't let her speak and said that she had slid on ice. Since then, there have been a few attempts to talk to her alone, and all have failed. They've gone so far as to get their church involved and to call a welfare check by the cops when he was out of the house. But if she was being assaulted, she has been refusing help. Snow was bad this year, and he blew a fit about the snowplows piling snow on his property. So he scattered screws on the roadway outside before they came by one morning. Then someone in the neighborhood got a puppy. It's quiet and has a fenced-in backyard. Its owners wake up in the middle of the night to the doorbell ringing. When they come out, Crazy Neighbor is standing on the road at the edge of the property. He tells them that the first time the dog gets out, they won't have a dog anymore, and pulls out a gun and waves it around before pointing it towards the backyard and saying bang. Obviously, they go back inside and call the cops. When confronted, Crazy Neighbor claims that he was out for a walk, thought they were awake and stopped by. He says he didn't get the gun out, but it had been on his belt and that he didn't mean his statement as a threat. He got some sort of citation from the police. Come spring, he has taken to sitting outside and writing something every time someone walks or drives by. We don't know what, but I have taken to driving differently home to avoid going by him. Most recently, someone put up a swing in the backyard. They came home from work to find tire tracks through their backyard, and the swing set run over and crushed. No one saw anything, but his massive truck happens to have the same kind of tires as the tread marks left behind. The retired cop has taken to compiling statements from everyone and keeping records, because we think that this is going to end badly. Edit. To anyone wondering, I have 2 more updates in other posts. Check my post history. But for a little bit of a short version, he's since done some nighttime creepy crawling, threatened to shoot children, and he got to do a little jail time. To keep it brief, when I was 17, my family and I lived in a rural town in Australia. We moved into a relatively isolated neighborhood, but about 50 to 100 meters next door lived a single old lady. When moving in, she seemed nice enough and introduced herself, etc. Always seemed a tad nosy and asking a lot of questions, but I put it down as what lonely people do. She seemed sweet, or so I thought. One day, on school holidays, I was home alone and making a sandwich in the kitchen. I look out the window over to her property and through her bedroom window. I thought I saw her figure in the distance, but it was hard to tell. For some creepy reason, I got my binoculars. I was bored, okay? I looked over, focused them, and my heart sank into my chest. Mouth dried and legs shook with shock as I realized that she was staring directly at me. After a few seconds, she made a massive grin on her face. I shut the blinds, told my parents, but they played it off, saying that I must have not looked properly. But that's not even the creepy part. The night before we were set to move, my father was in the Air Force. I finished playing around on my PC before going to bed. I awoke to rustling sounds outside. I got freaked out when I realized that it wasn't merely creaking sounds in the house. With frozen courage, I peeked out the blinds ever so slightly, and bam, I made eye contact with the old lady directly out my window. My body froze and she started quietly laughing, not moving her gaze at all. I shut the blinds, panicked, and shouted for my parents. The three of us searched outside, but nothing. My dad confronted her and she acted like the phony, sweet old lady with dementia again. Thank God we moved the next day. As we packed, something in the back of my mind told me that she was watching from afar. Still sends shivers down my spine. I still have paranoia, trouble sleeping at night, and bad dreams. I try to justify it as mental illness or dementia, but it still scares me even though I'm 22. I just imagine one day the same lady out my window, even though I've moved across the country. I just want to say how much I appreciate this subreddit, being a safe place to share these stories. I've shared a few stories in a previous post, but reading what others have shared has jogged my memory, and also made me realize how messed up some of these situations really were. A year ago, my apartment complex decided that they wanted to renovate my unit, so I had to move out at the end of my lease. I live in Denver, and rent is pretty ridiculous here, so I started worrying about finding something affordable in my neighborhood, which I love. I posted on the Nextdoor app to see if anyone in my neighborhood knew of any affordable rentals in the area. I immediately got a message from someone named Joe, who said that one of the condos in his complex was going to be up for rent soon, and he knew the owner. He offered to get me in touch with the owner. I asked if he could send me pictures of the unit, and he asked if he could text me some pictures of his neighbor took, because the chat function on the app is really slow. I now feel stupid for doing this, but I gave him my phone number. I kid you not, I received a phone call from an unknown number within seconds. I don't normally answer calls from unknown numbers, but I was expecting a call from a number that wasn't saved in my phone, so I answered it. I was completely bewildered when the person said, "Hi, it's Joe. How's your day going?" Huh? It took me by surprise, and I didn't know what to say. He started to shoot the crap on the phone, talking about how he works nights, and how tired he is, and how he takes care of his daughter while his girlfriend works during the day. I finally interrupted and said, "So, about the condo?" He pretty much disregarded that and said, "I don't think my girlfriend would appreciate me talking to you, but I don't have to tell her, right?" I said I have to go and immediately hung up the phone. As soon as I did, he started texting me. It was really bizarre and alarming to me. I blocked his number, and moments later he found me on Facebook and sent me a friend request. I'm 32 years old, but it was so disturbing to me that I called my parents to tell them about it, and how unnerved it made me. And the worst part is that on Nextdoor, even if your exact address isn't listed, your complex is. I was pretty certain that I didn't have my address visible in my profile, but I checked and sure enough, my address and unit number were public. Unable to contact me any other way, he started messaging me again on Nextdoor, asking if I wanted to go on a walk with him. You can't block or report people on the app, so I deleted it. One night, a month or so later, I had a knock at my door at around 10 o'clock on a weeknight. I looked out my peephole, but couldn't get a good enough look at the person. He had his head down slightly. Either way, I don't answer the door for anyone I'm not expecting, especially not a random guy at 10 o'clock at night. Feeling panicked, I called my neighbor across the hall. She's an older woman and we look out for each other since we both live alone. I asked her if it looked like he was a delivery guy at the wrong door. She opened her door to get a good look at the guy, and that spooked him because he literally ran away. I have no idea if this was the next door guy or not, but my gut tells me that it was. This was a big wake-up call. I always felt like I practiced good online safety, but I didn't even know that my address was visible on Nextdoor. I'll never be casual or lazy about privacy settings like that again. For a bit of context, I grew up in the middle of farmland in a large 1800s Victorian home. Given its history, there has always been several shacks and barns that once belonged to the builder of this house. There's a highway that sees maybe 3 cars on it during the night, and directly across from said highway, about 200 feet inward of a cornfield, is a shack that I have always found creepy. As kids, myself and my friends would dare each other to go inside and look, which always ended up with us going as a team. Nothing scary was ever found. Maybe a few broken glasses, metal piles, and miscellaneous items. There was no electricity or any sort of utility that made it homely. Years go by, and the existence of the shack becomes a part of my daily life. However, one particular night as I was watching TV, I noticed a light going off and on outside of my window. After getting startled, I dismissed it as passing cars, simply more frequent than they typically are. An hour passes. It's nearing midnight and the light stays on. This time, I know for sure it's coming from outside. My family was asleep, but being my pansy 16-year-old self, I needed confirmation. Too bad for me, no one wants to go check it out. So I go alone. I grabbed my pocket knife and a flashlight, the best I could think of with my shaken thoughts, and I take off into the night. As I neared the highway, the light turns off, almost making me choke on air. But I had to figure out what the heck was going on. I make it to the entrance of the shack, which has no door, and slowly begin to enter, my flashlight scanning the room for any sign of life. What happened next, I'll never forget. 5 feet away from me, there's an old tattered recliner, facing away, that my father had tossed in there for future disposal. I shine my light on it, because I knew I'd seen it rock ever so slightly. As I did that, a man stands up from the recliner, saying absolutely nothing. All I could tell was that he was middle-aged and wearing a jacket of sorts. Before I could process what was happening, I was already sprinting across the road and praying that he wasn't behind me. It felt like years before I could make it to my door, but as I'm about to make it into safety, I decide to look back. He was standing in the road completely still. No words whatsoever. It's been 7 years since then. The shack still stands. The recliner remains in place. My dad never believed me. I wish someone could share the dread that I had when I realized the recliner was facing a window, which was directed straight at my house. To the guy that was staying in that shack, please, let's not meet again. Thank you so much for listening to all of the stories in this video. I hope you enjoyed them. I also hope that you enjoy the extra rain at the end. Get a good night's sleep, everyone, and I'll read to you in the next video. Bye-bye now.